Hello, listeners. We have some exciting news kicking off 2025. Precipice Fiction, all of us, all six of us, are partnering with Westwords to bring a brand new year-long speculative fiction writing program. And it will be kicking off end of February, which means you have between now, as you listen to this, and the start of February to apply. And that's right. All six of us here at Precipice Fiction will be your writing tutors for an entire year. And being an online course, that means it is open to anyone, everywhere. As long as you can make your time zone work with the class time, you are welcome to join. It is best suited for people who already have a first draft of an existing speculative fiction manuscript, meaning it can be fantasy, sci-fi, horror, and all the wonderful subgenres in between. Applications are open now. The program is called Westwords Speculative Writing. You can look up westwords.com.au and look up Westwords Speculative Writing, or just Googling Westwords Speculative Writing, you will find the page that has all the information on the course. Can't wait to read your applications. See you all soon.
It's such a dick move by Zoom. It's intentional sabotage to have it be like the double click for recording.
Yeah, it's like now you're never going to get a recording. Yeah, that's them saving room on their servers, surely. That's all they're doing.
We should
They
write
don't want to pay for server space.
We should write them an angry letter. Like, Zoom, you've destroyed, thousands of... Anyway.
If you do this again, we're going back to Skype. Sincerely.
Ali, we are never going back to Skype, okay? It's not on the table. It's never been on the... We've never been on Skype. How can we go back?
Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers. Brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land that this podcast was created on.
Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast for writers by writers, because sometimes we feel like pros, like we know everything in the world, and other times we just feel like cons, where we're just bullshitting our way through to hopefully eventual success.
Hopefully, yeah.
I hear that's how it's done. Welcome to a special one-on-one episode. I would like to say we're doing this special, like it's like a new fandangled thing, and we're not doing it just out of necessity because we're just busy. We're living busy adult lives, and it's getting harder and harder to carve out times across our many time zones to chat. But no, this is like totally something we planned forever, isn't it, Matan? For
Absolutely.
You and I to chat.
Yeah, like look, honestly, maybe I'm just a glass half full guy, but I'm kind of happy that we're getting to do this one-on-one. We kind of brought it up earlier. The other four people are really cool people, but I feel like me and you really align in our geek spots,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe more so than we'd had the chance to showcase until now. So
yeah,
let's see how today
goes. I think we've got this affinity from across the room. Like if ever Patrick Rothfuss or Brandon Sanderson came up, I think there was like that invisible eye contact, because it's like, we're there, we get it.
Let's drag them with us. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. So if you haven't guessed by now, listeners, we're going to be talking about fantasy. That's what Matan and I are getting at. We're both fantasy lovers. We have a lot in common, and there is a deep dive episode on fantasy already in our back catalogue. It is episode 17. It's hosted by Paddy. And I wanted to flag that one that if you haven't listened to it, that's okay. You'll still enjoy this episode, but definitely listen to that episode, because I think there's going to be a lot of assumed knowledge. That episode does a lot of good work of like going through all the tropes, really unpicking all of it, so you have a really good understanding of what high fantasy is. And then this podcast, Matan and I we're gonna jump off that assumed knowledge, and we're gonna go even deeper and just roll around in the mud.
Can we call this like the sequel, or is this a remake? What are we doing here?
Oh, maybe sequel.
A spin-off. Okay.
Yes, a spin-off, because it's got a whole new cast, because I wasn't a part of the last chat. And I
spin-off. Let's go with a spin-off. Same universe, different everything. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So that's a really long way for me to say hi, Matan. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
That should be in the Guinness record books for longest hello. I'm great, Ali. Thank you. My name is Matan Elul. You should recognize my voice by now. You should definitely recognize Ali's voice by now, listeners. I'm great. Thank you for asking. Excited to fantasize.
What do you do? Are you a writer?
Oh, right. I am a writer. I'm an English teacher by profession. That's what I do in my mornings. I teach English to high schoolers, which comes with a lot of baggage. Anyway, when I don't do that, I also write fiction, horror, and I'm doing a Bachelor of English Literature, which I might have mentioned 12 to 15 times. But yeah, that's me.
Amazing. And hi, I'm Ali. Nice. If this is the first time tuning in, hi. I'm a screenwriter. I also write prose. I'm listening back to old episodes. I say I dabble in prose, and then
Come on.
someone recently slapped me on the wrist, and they're like, "You can't sell yourself short. You got to just own what you do." So I'm like, "Okay, I write screenplays, and I also write prose." Hey,
Ali, you are drowning in prose, okay? Dabbling in prose. You are submerged. You are crying out for help.
too many prose. I got a life jacket on over here, made of punctuation. Yes. Well, hopefully, we're in the middle of writing our first drafts for the next Precipice fiction anthology, and I was in a bit of a dry spot there, mainly because life got really busy with my day job, working as a creative producer at a literature development organization. But now I'm back into writing it again, and I'm really enjoying it, and the whole freedom of burst drafting. So I'm most certainly writing in high fantasy for my novella. What are you writing in, Matan?
For the new mythic or in general?
The newer mythic.
The newer mythic. Actually, I'm writing something I've never written before, in terms of combining genres I'm comfortable with genres I simply haven't tried yet, which is something I was really excited to do. I'm not writing anything that's like avant-garde or avant-garde. Is that how you say it?
It is now.
It
Yes,
is now.
avant-garde.
The point is,
yeah.
it's nothing too crazy. It's just not something I did before. I don't want to spoil it because,
okay.
like,
Genre is the spoiler. Okay.
I think that's the way the story comes off, but I kind of want to hear from you guys if that's how you think the story comes off. I don't want to tell you it's something and then like cloud your judgment. Like you will.
I know that's totally fair. And I think that's really valid for our listeners when approaching how to share their work with beta readers. If you want to not color their first read of your manuscript, then leave it as a surprise.
Just leave the manuscript in a basket outside their door. Don't even say who it's from. That's probably the ideal way to go about this.
Put the manuscript in a basket, put it down the river, and it'll find a publisher.
The daughter of a pharaoh would be your first beta reader.
That's actually, I'm going to circle back to that in our topic today. So that's wonderful. Have you been, before we like deep, we've got the spades out. We're about to start digging into fantasy, but before we do, final detour, what have you been consuming, reading, watching lately, Matan?
You know, this is going to feel a bit childish, but this is the second podcast in a row when I'm going to commend an Irish piece of literature and the Irish person is not present. So I'm just going to have to keep reading Irish things until he shows up.
Until you get James's like stamp of approval.
I'm on a streak. I'm just gonna make sure I get the name right. It's called Small Things Like These, written by Claire Keegan. It is a 2021 novella set in Ireland in the 1980s. This book came out really recently, like 2 or 3 years. It was actually nominated for the Booker Prize. And in a nutshell, why do I recommend it to you, listeners? First of all, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It's kind of a slice of life. It's a vignette of life in a not so hospitable environment. 1980s Ireland, a small town, financial hardships. But what I really liked it is that a lot of the times when you read about difficulty, it's linked to singular events like, you know, this happened, the plague, the war, the COVID, whatever. But this is just normal life. The difficulty of normal life. It's not a story about Oliver Twist. It's not a story about a dystopian society. It's just what is hard about life as they really are, which I think can be really touching and eye-opening to people, because sometimes we almost feel like we don't get to complain because there's always something worse out there.
Yes.
And it's also the novella is also linked to an unfortunately very real historical injustice that has happened in Ireland during that time. That's related to the abuse of children by the church. And I won't say too much, but it's a really short read, guys. Yeah, give it a try.
Nice. Yeah, no, it sounds really familiar. I haven't read it, but when you started mentioning its accolades, I'm like, well, that's probably what I've heard it from. So, very nice. I will mention The Rings of Power as my watch. I've just finished it, season 2. I loved it. So I liked season 1 when I know a lot of people didn't. And then season 2 comes along and I love it even more. Like, maybe not more, but I think whatever pacing or too many threads stuff that may have made the first season a harder watch, they've solved all that in season 2. The pacing is now one of its main strengths in season 2. I love it so much.
It felt more. First of all, I watched both seasons back to back.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
I kind of forgot that it exists until the promotion for season 2 came out. Like, oh, okay. Might as well get a Prime membership. Yeah, I did not pirate the show. You should be proud of me. And I thought the second season felt more like Lord of the Rings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. I think it definitely, the first season wanted to do a lot. There were a lot of characters that it's not to say the characters lacked depth, but I think there was just so little screen time spread among so many characters, it was hard to really latch onto them emotionally. While this season is like, okay, we're gonna not jump around as much. We'll do, say, an entire episode on one plot line. So loosely, you've got the dwarves got something over here, the elves got something over here. You got they're not hobbits, but the half-foots have something going on over here. They're not hobbits. Yeah. And then you've got the Numenorians have something else going on over there. So it's where first season jumped around quite a lot, that it was like a cyclone. This season's like, look, we'll just do a whole episode with the elves. So you feel really grounded with these characters on this particular emotional journey at this moment. And then it would just do really tight episodes that way. And I'm like, like Celebrimbor's arc this season really got me. I loved it so much. Oh, gosh.
Didn't you get these vibes from some episodes, like a 9th episode in Game of Thrones vibes? Like, we're just here in this event today. Like, you know what I mean? Like hard home vibes.
Like how peak dramatic it was.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
We're just watching this elven city do war for the next 60 minutes.
Yes, yeah, no, it would just focus on one big set piece. You're right, and that's what I thought it did. Really, it just lent into that, and just the time pressure. It spent a lot of time on the manipulation of Celebrimbor by Sauron, who's presenting as Anatar, and just that complex emotional journey. Like, we're joking the whole time. We're just like, the sex must be so good between the two of them.
There's definitely these they hold each other's gaze just a second too long, and you're like, ooh,
they're so in love, and it's so beautiful. And then the full extent of the emotional manipulations revealed, and then like the drama of the elves. We made a lot of jokes about forgive me, the king's name, Gilgalad. Yes. King Gilgalad. They've gone for a very cartoony theatrical Gilgalad in this, and we're like, look, he's not the best fighter, he's not the best at magic, he's not the most strategic mind, but he was clearly head of the drama club, and that's why they elected him as their king. And it's amazing. He's very dramatic. And Celebrimbor, I think, was a part of the same drama troupe when they were kids. And it was
absolutely. I think we can do I think we should do a whole episode on Rings of Power. But I also feel like this is such a treasure trove for fan fiction. Like, this whole show is just begging. Anyway, Rings of Power. Watch it.
Great. So there's a taste of how much Matan and I love high fantasy. So we're going to get into it now. Not so much why we love it, but how understanding it can create a deeper appreciation for it, and help improve your journey into writing high fantasy.
Sure.
So how I pitched this to Matan was, I'm going to rant for like a little bit at the start here. I'm going to propose some ideas. I've come to some conclusions as I've been musing on high fantasy lately, and Matan is welcome to jump in, interrupt, argue with me, and then at the end we're going to talk a lot about Brandon Sanderson. So that's the journey you're all in for, listeners. So I'm really keen, like a side quest of mine as a part of my work. I want to launch a fantasy program next year for emerging writers. So that's why I've been doing a lot of pre-thinking about fantasy and how to teach it. So therefore articulating how can you teach it. I want to fight for the genre. I think fantasy gets a lot of like that genre cringe, and then even people who write it, they're quite serious writers, but then people are like, oh, what do you write? And they've got to be like, oh, I write fantasy. And so like, have you experienced that, Matan? That kind of that cringe? Or are we too cool to feel that cringe?
No, I do know what you're talking about. I feel like Game of Thrones did a great job of kind of like pushing it towards the mainstream. It's not just sort of Shannara, and
Yes.
I think that helped because fantasy, when it goes geek, it goes really geek, okay? It goes all the way. And D&D has done, a lot, like, because a lot of people that have thoughts about D&D have never played D&D, and even if they know about it, maybe some of their thoughts are justified. It's a lot of fun, but it is a bunch of nerds sitting on a table with Excel sheets, and if that doesn't tell you enough, then
the perfect mapping of mathematics and creativity and role play for the perfect time. And we do it when we're drinking, so it's also super fun.
It's a little cool.
Anyway, this is me who had a super late night on Thursday night because some people came around to play Magic and like Magic the Gathering. So it's like midnight and we're like, it's well past our bedtime, but we were playing Magic. It was a wild night. So a big part of me is...
I agree with your statement. I do agree with your statement.
So a big part of me is thinking more about fantasy is like, what's modern fantasy? What's this new wave of fantasy? How can we elevate fantasy, not just in the minds of readers, audience, but also the people who write it? Because unfortunately, I do read a lot of submissions that come through from emerging writers writing fantasy, and I'm like, oh, it's not quite good. It's not there yet. So that's why I'm like, clearly there's this mass love of people who want to write fantasy. So how can we equip them with the tools to become better writers, to write better fantasy? And that's like a huge passion of mine. I'm here to like single-handedly create the new wave of fantasy in Australia. So yeah, a small task, but today's podcast is like an offshoot of that thinking I've been doing. So I will also kind of pose the question. Paddy's podcast, episode 70, does a really good job of discussing Tolkien and the shadow Tolkien has over all of fantasy. And we have it, and that episode also lays and explains why it's such a trope-heavy genre and why you do need to be in conversation with all these tropes so audiences can recognize that you're in this genre. But I had this question the other day from someone who's like, look, I want to write fantasy. I want to engage with all these tropes I love, but how can I do something like fresh or new in this space? And I'm like, look, that's a good question. I'm going to genuinely take that question and run away and think about that. Matan, what's your knee-jerk reaction when you posed with
Absolutely. I think that's such a big discussion topic in fantasy, because fantasy basically as a genre exists in thanks. I don't want to make anyone seem small, but Tolkien is clearly the godfather of fantasy, and the path that he has paved is the path that a lot of writers immediately and decades later have decided to follow. And the result of that is almost a bit like the MCU, where a lot of the movies feel samey. They have the same tone, the same quirks, the same, definitely the same setting, even if sometimes you go Guardians of the Galaxy in the stars and sometimes you go to Asgard, I don't know. But what happened is that you basically had a lot of fantasy books that felt as if they could have happened in the same world. Like you could have taken this story and put it in that world building and nothing would have to change, maybe except the names of the orcs. Sometimes it's orcs, sometimes it's demons, sometimes it's something else. And I think that created kind of a comfort zone for the genre that was not exactly healthy for it, because if you liked it, you were happy. But if you didn't like it, you had no reason to check it out because you felt like
It's
they're just
inaccessible. Yeah.
yeah. It's like it's the same thing again and again. It's a sword, it's a shield, it's a wizard, it's an evil species like the orcs or the darkspawn from Dragon Age, the video game, and it's always more of the same. Whereas you are starting to see, I think, and I apologize if it's happened a while ago, but you are starting to see the fantasy that is not. I'm not going to do Tolkien. I'm not going to do an offshoot of Tolkien. I'm not even going to do Tolkien, which is Game of Thrones. I'm just going to do something else. And then you raise the question, what is fantasy? Why is that fantasy and not sci-fi? Where's the line?
Ooh.
And I'll just toss in some examples. You had Ember in the Ashes. I should really find the author's name. Ember in the Ashes by Sabah Tahir, which is basically a fantasy set in this like desert Roman-esque setting. Instead of the classic Middle Ages, you have, the centurions and all that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, you had the fifth season by again, I gotta get the names ready. N.K. Jemisin, am I right?
That's it. Yes.
Yeah, she's terrific, and she did something that's even more different. It felt almost like she took it out of Avatar. Suddenly everybody's got earthquake powers. So you can do fantasy different, but it does feel true that a lot of them felt like, yeah, I'm just gonna do Tolkien, but with my twist on it. So they're gonna have a sword, it's gonna be a wizard, and there are gonna be elves.
Look, I love that you touched on two things that are literally my subject headings to unpack. So what an amazing intuitive intro you've just done there. Thank you. So essentially those two dot points are why read this? So you were talking about if people aren't into Tolkien, why should they pick up another book that just looks like another Tolkien book? So I'm really interested in, let's unpack the purpose of fantasy as our way of helping define the genre. And the other one is, you organically ran into it, is sci-fi or fantasy. So I'll start there because the team were having a crack at defining high fantasy versus low fantasy in the previous episode. And a lot of that discussion landed on the idea of setting. And the setting is what makes it high fantasy. And Phoenix had a really good way of putting it, that you have almost magic realism becomes urban fantasy. And it's almost like the more unreal elements you introduce, then you're moving higher and higher up this scale until you hit high fantasy / epic fantasy. We kind of landed on the same idea that high fantasy and epic fantasy, I agree, are kind of interchangeable terms. I wanted to pitch a counter interpretation to that. So this is where I'm going to start positing my own ideas out into the universe. So yes, I believe setting does have a really important place of understanding this genre of high fantasy. But I actually think one of the main axes that pivots this genre is stakes and the scale of the conflict rather than just setting. Soon I also want to do an episode on the hierarchy of editing. So get ready for that, listeners. But the idea that you can edit your work on different axes, and setting and world building being one of those axes. But I view genre inclusive of stakes and scale as another axis. So that's how I'm thinking of it. Those are my terms. So defining high fantasy with stakes and the scale of the conflict. I'll talk about that really fun meme that was going around the internet for a while that was like, it's sci-fi when it's this, and it's fantasy when it's this. Do you know this meme, Matan?
I do think I've seen that, yeah.
I found two of my favorite earlier Googling around, and one is, fantasy is when there's an entire chapter describing food. Sci-fi is when there's an entire chapter describing transportation. And then another one was, sci-fi is when you're depressed about the future. Fantasy is when you're depressed about the past.
What if you're just depressed? Okay, never mind. Yeah. That's literary fiction, guys. Okay.
But I think those are both excellent. And someone kind of extrapolated the food versus transport one, where, say, sci-fi will just wave its hand past food being like, I like the red tablets the most. And then that's all you get. That's all the detail you get. While in fantasy, they're like, we ride horses. The horse is the transport. It's not the focus. Moving on. Something. And that was brilliant. So this is what I want to kind of unpack.
I agree with you. I think that, look, it might be controversial to say, but let's be honest here for a second. At the end of the day, and I'm so happy none of these sci-fi guys from our podcast are here to defend this, but in the end of the day, sci-fi, sci-fi is fantasy, okay? You are fantasizing. You have no idea how to get to the speed of light. You have no idea what aliens look like. It's just the same. It's just that you guys have a kink for space. That's the only difference. It's just fantasy in space. Admit it. You say, oh, there's science behind it. You've made it up. That science doesn't exist yet. It cannot be scientific just because you use some mumbo jumbo you watched on Doctor Who. Okay, I got that out of the way.
That's so funny. Thank you for getting that out.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to throw a new definition at you. So you might not take to this, but these are the definitions that I had a bit of an epiphany lately that I've been circling around. So to split the hairs between sci-fi and fantasy, sci-fi deals with philosophy and technology.
Okay.
So as an author, if you've got a bone to pick in that direction, there's a certain philosophy you want to extrapolate, you want to explore. If there's a certain technology that you want to envisage the effects, how humans, how society relate to it.
An example?
Yeah, an example of sci-fi. Okay, fine. I immediately go to the Philip K. Dick books.
Good. Yeah, I would too, actually.
They thinking of something that
Yeah.
is interested in philosophy and different people's philosophies and how they clash and manifest and how technologies rule people's lives and change. I think Philip K. Dick is like the perfect crosshairs as that example for me.
I agree. It really, that really checks the boxes you've mentioned, because it is about what if we could talk to dead people? What if we could put people, basically he created the Matrix before the Matrix existed. But what if we could... Yeah, I can't believe I haven't thought about it.
Because the Matrix and the Wachowski sisters, a lot of what they write is driven by a philosophy. They'll pick a philosophy, like they'll go away and read Kant or something, and then they'll come back, and then they're like, we're going to write a script that is a treatment of this. And they get a sci-fi script, like Sense8 is very much that, as well as the Matrix. We're not going to talk about the Bee Queen, Jupiter Ascending. We're not going to talk about Jupiter Ascending because I think that's about something else. That's not a sci-fi.
When you do a comparative essay in the academy, there are two ways to do it. You can do it in blocks, which you completely discuss a topic and then move to the next one, or you can do it in layers, which you go A, B, A, B. So that's what I would like to hear from you now. You said philosophy is a sci-fi thing.
Yes.
What about fantasy?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked. So yes, if I would define sci-fi as discussing philosophy and technology, I define fantasy as discussing mythology and religion.
Examples?
Examples. We're going to spend the whole episode on examples.
Nice.
So that is my crux of how I'm going to split hairs. Paddy in episode 70, I'm going to go and listen to it, folks. He brought up the observation that so much of high fantasy is rooted in Judeo-Christendom. And I would argue that this is why. Not because all the writers of high fantasy were subconsciously influenced by their cultural religion. And when they imagined big scale, see, we're circling back to scale here, that's just where their mind went to. But I would argue it's actually a bit more intentional that the fundamental reason why and how the fantasy genre exists is to interrogate and be in conversation with religion and myth. I'd go so far to argue that if you're a writer working in fantasy, and if your work fails to engage with myth or religion in some way, you're not writing fantasy. You've missed the point of the genre.
It's crazy because you said religion, and my knee-jerk reaction was like, really? And then I thought about it. And if you look at, let's put Tolkien aside for a second.
Yep.
If you look at Patrick Rothfuss as the Name of the Wind, the big villain, the Thanos of his story, is an evil god. And if you look at Chronicles of Narnia, I mean that thing is just dripping with religion and Jesus complex. But again, religion. And wow, and even Sanderson, he keeps escalating. He keeps escalating until
religious treatment.
Eventually it looks like at the beginning it might look like it's a local thing, but as you get to the crescendo of the conflict, you're like, no, this is God versus God again.
Yes. And so that's what I mean by scale and stakes. So I will circle back to talking a little bit about low fantasy. So we're not just talking every fantasy story has to end in a god versus god or our protagonist versing a god. But I think there is low stake story examples of a character who in some way engages with a mythos, a mythology of their life, or with a religious structures. But the scale might just be self-contained. It's their everyday life. And the stakes are this person needing to grow and come to a new realization and grapple with mythos and religion just within themselves. And that's what I'm going to go on to define as low fantasy. It's still dealing with myth and religion, but our stakes are maybe just that person's house, just that person's life.
So
Neil Gaiman writes a lot of these.
Yeah. I was going to
Yes.
say a Six of Crows by Lee Bardugo, which
Yes,
it's
yes.
basically you got this low stake thing, but it's all in the background, in the periphery. In the periphery, you still have that Tolkien-esque, struggle
Is
between good and
happening.
evil.
Yes.
And these guys are kind of dealing with the shockwaves of that, even though that's not what they directly face.
Correct. So I would, by this definition I'm honing in on, I would call that low fantasy. Because their world has this mythos. They are in the shadow of this mythos. Their whole culture's defined it, but their stakes are their heist that they're pulling off. And then high fantasy, I'm defining as where the scale is at a level of entire worlds, gods, and in Branderson's case, cosmic. The cosmere is the scale. So it's a size thing is how I'm defining my low to high scale for the purposes of today's podcast.
Nice.
So I'm going to argue that the better you engage with mythology and religion, the better your fantasy is, the better your fantasy story is. You've used it as a full genre rather than a series of just window dressing or aesthetic or trope choices. You're actually engaging with the purpose of the genre and not just masquerading as the genre. And I do wonder if a lot of fantasy books that fail to grab me is because they're just using a dragon. A dragon's here, and I'm like, cool. but dragons are such rich symbols. They're full of symbolism. They cultural signifiers across different cultures. So works that want to be in conversation with the myth of a dragon or what this dragon means to this fictional culture's society, I'm there and I'm engaged. But when the dragon just feels like window dressing or a really cool vehicle, it lacks something for me. I'm like, it's only recently I would then define it to myself. Well, it's not engaging in what fantasy's meant to be doing. It's meant to be a commentary on myth.
So just to clarify, when you say the good use of a dragon versus the bad use of a dragon, like the dragon has to stand for something else. It cannot just be a powerful enemy NPC for you to fight. It has to. So the first dragon that comes to my mind, again, Tolkien, is Smaug, because Smaug is such a great character. And like you said, he does have that extra meaning. Smaug is, Tolkien invented this, but he's greed. He's the essence, the most violent, brutal essence of greed that there can be, which is to destroy an entire people just to sit on their corpses and gold inside a mountain. It doesn't get more heavy-handed than that.
And I think that's speaking to a beautiful myth, as old as myths are. The idea of the dragon in that case represents any number of stories of going to the cave where the riches and the treasures are. And you got to fight past the guardian of the riches, or you have to prove yourself. Other versions of it are proving yourself to the guardian of the riches. What's on the other side of the cave? Like it's a staple mythos that's so embedded in us. And I think Smaug is another manifestation of that. It's another take on that. It's speaking to a deep mythos we know, and it's tweaking and playing with it. And Tolkien's doing his own thing with that mythos. So I also wanted to add that in episode 70, Paddy observes that the typical setting of fantasy is medieval. It doesn't necessarily matter which continent, but it is more like that Middle Ages to the Iron Age in terms of technology. So then to further prove my thesis of mythology and religion, I would ask the reason why that is because in terms of how prevalent religion and myth were to everyday life in that setting, this is an era where religion and myth ruled almost every moment, every choice that every person made every day.
I have another reason why I think that is.
Yes.
I think it's more of a functional reason. A fireball is a lot more impressive if the other guy doesn't have a shotgun.
Yeah, that too. But myth making is still, we will swing to Brandon Sanderson, but era to Mistborn. Are you across that, Matan?
Yes. But I understand. Yeah. But he established the story and the world with the Mistborns and their magic was established first without competition, without significant competition, and then it's like, okay, let's take this established thing and now let's see. It's a bit like what Avatar: Legend of Korra did, right? You establish what benders can do without having the modern technology, and now you said, okay, let's take them to modern technology. By the way, manga fans, that's what Boruto is doing as well, apparently.
Yeah, not very well, but that is what they're doing. You're right.
That's a different story, yeah.
So you're right. They establish how impressive the magic is on its own and the law and in both cases religion behind these powers before the new technology is thrown at them. So they get to be this hybrid. Now suddenly technology, which I'm calling a sci-fi tool, is part of the conversation and is mixing it up. I guess where I was going with the Mistborn example is the Wild West for me is almost an example of myth making as well. It's a bit closer to home, but as in like on the timeline between the past and where we are now. But the idea of mythological figures who exist in the Wild West, the sheriffs who had this amount of this body count and could draw faster than anyone else.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
There's a rich culture of myth within Westerns themselves. So for Brandenson to do a mashup of fantasy and Western and tie it together with myth, like Waxilium gets to walk around and everyone's like, you're that guy.
Yes.
Like it's just such a wonderful nod to myth making for me.
You made me think about Rango. Rango is the one with
the
chameleon.
Yes.
Man, that snake, there's a snake in that one and it's so intimidating. He's got like a machine gun on his tail. Holy crap. I think what I also want to add is because basically for fantasy to work, and I really like that you touched on the Wild West, it's still a setting where violence is the solution and strength is the solution, and violence is almost kind of sterilized. It's clean violence because I'm not chopping off the arm of a citizen, I'm chopping off the arm of an orc, or I'm not shooting a human, I'm shooting I don't know, a rock formation with eyes and sentient thought. And so violence is fun, it's action, but it's fantasy violence. You even have that in movies. The trigger warning can be fantasy violence, because when they're shooting Kamehameha at each other, it's not the same as stabbing each other with a shiv. So when you bring that violence to today's world, it's a bit harder for the escapism to work, because now you say, no, but that guy just blew up a 7-Eleven. That's real. Whereas if you put it in a setting that's the Wild West and everything is facades and everything is like,
that's a saloon I've never visited or will visit. Yes.
These people they all have black hats, so it's fine,
And I think there's something about, I'm going to bring it back to myth, but the idea that when you would tell or you would pass a myth down, maybe I'll lean on Greek for an example of you defeat one of those, the monsters in Greek history.
Oh, yeah.
It's not necessarily focusing on, and then Hercules had PTSD for the next 5 years after that event. Like
Hercules specifically did have a bit of...
Yeah, no, maybe that was a bad example. But I guess when that story's told, it's not so much... It's about Hercules being this great guy who did this massive heroic feat. That's what we're focusing on. That's the myth we tell and create the legend of. It's not the crux of the story is not the psychology. We're not the genre is not concerned with so much with the psychology.
No,
And
it's
I guess
concerned
that's
with
where
religion a lot of the times. The Greek
yes,
myths are almost like bedtime
yes,
stories, like do
yes.
not go against the gods because they will make you think your family is someone else and you'll kill them, which is what they did to Hercules. But
Yes. Yeah, no, you absolutely get it. And I think that's where modern fantasy is bringing in a bit more. Well, if we focus a bit more on the psychology, that is a way of adding an extra shade to the genre that we haven't necessarily done before. But I think always keeping in mind that if you can always be in conversation with myth and religion, I guess what I'm saying is that's what fantasy does best over the other genres. Though it's a tool you can use to investigate these subjects, where sci-fi is excellent for if you want
if
to
this
talk about a new
happens,
technology,
yeah,
sci-fi is your
what?
tool.
Yeah, I like that. I really like the way you distinguish between them. It makes a lot of sense. Like you're almost saying sci-fi is a warning for the future or the present sometimes.
Sci-fi, yes. Well, that's that wonderful quote before. Sci-fi is when you're depressed about the future. Fantasy is when you're
Yes.
depressed about the past. And I think that's because our mythology and our religion come from our past,
Mm.
while our technologies and our philosophies are looking to our future.
You just made me think about Black Mirror, but yeah,
Mm.
talk about sci-fi that's warning you. Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head here. It really makes sense when you look at it, when you zoom out and you try to like look at these two things separately. It does make a lot of sense that sci-fi is here. Well, good sci-fi, engaging sci-fi, at least for me and you, I'm sure, is that kind of sci-fi that poses the
Yes.
question of what are we if this happens, or what could we become if this happens? Yeah, fantasy, myths. Yeah, absolutely. I'm running through all
I
the
can see
myths.
your brain is working. It looks amazing. So I just wanted to posit as a fun hypothetical before we move on. So say you're writing in a medieval setting, but the story you're actually concerned about writing is, I don't know, my character invents they hook up the potato for the first time and do the potato battery. And if your story then goes on to explore how your potato battery shapes this small town, the guy who invented this, I would argue you're actually writing a sci-fi story. It just happens to be in a medieval setting that would otherwise have all the other tropes and
Well,
clothes of a fantasy.
I think you've just concerned yourself with steampunk, for example. Is that not a lot of the times what that is? Because steampunk
Yes.
can occur in the 19th century.
Yes.
It
Yep.
can be in the past. And that's clearly sci-fi because people are jumping from rooftops with steam canisters in their hips, Attack on Titan. But
Yep.
that's definitely sci-fi, even though there you go, Attack on Titan. Clearly, it's a manga that's clearly set in a past time in terms of technology. They don't have tablets, they don't have internet, they are in the past, but they're in an alternate past. It's almost like sci-fi that started 200 years earlier.
Yes, I think that's a perfect. I'm going to jump into anime in a second. So you're so good at predicting where this conversation's going.
We watch the same things, Ali. That's the only
We do watch
explanation.
the same thing. So Attack on Titans, I would argue, yes, it's very concerned with its philosophy and discussing its philosophies, and it treats its magic. So magic is, say, it's the you can turn into a titan.
Become a
You can turn
16
into
foot killing machine. Yeah.
the founding titans and all that, if that's our magic, but they weaponize it. They're using it with like kind of modern quotation marks war methods, battle methods, and
Yep.
they're like, this is our technology. We've recruited this many of the 7 main titans. They've got this many of the 7 main titans, and so it becomes a philosophy and technology show that's explored. It's less concerned about religion. There's a little bit of it there, but I don't think that's what
It
it's
feels like
for
dressing
breaking.
in that case.
Yeah, it just needed a religion to go over it.
Yeah.
And not, and it has its own myth, but I don't think it's in conversation with too many, like, I don't know, big old cyclops maybe, and giants in general, but aside from that, it's not drawing on too many other
Yeah,
mythos.
it kind of subverts the myths. I mean, it kind of invites you to think that, this is just a person that existed and people are just taking this the wrong way. rather than this is the hand of God trying to direct humanity.
Though there could be room for argument because towards the end they're in that alternate plane that is some kind of limbo, and it does get a bit that's more that way. I would argue that's more religion and myth, that direction of it. So here we go. Let me put this to you. Name some other famous shonen for me, Matan.
Wow. Okay, I'm such a normie. Okay, like don't be too impressed with me.
No, name the basics.
Okay, Naruto.
Yes.
Inuyasha. God, I love Inuyasha. Bleach. What do you call it? Brotherhood. Full Metal Alchemist. Oh, Phoenix loves that one.
Interesting.
Yu Yu Hakusho. Shaman King.
I can't talk to that one too much. But okay, you've named some basics, and let me throw in Dragon Ball Z for you, and I'll
how did I not say Dragon Ball Z? I've literally played Dragon Ball Sparking Zero for like 72 hours straight. Got my ass kicked by Ape. Anyway.
So you're having a great time.
Yeah.
And I'll also throw in Jujutsu Kaisen. So there were maybe Full Metal Alchemist I will pull out and put to the side.
Yep.
All the others, I'm going to argue fall on the
Sci-fi.
fantasy side.
Really?
Or high fantasy side. Because ask yourself, are they in conversation with myth and religion as the core roots of their magic system?
Well, the journey to the West jumps out immediately when you think about Dragon Ball.
That's mythology. Tick. Yes.
And then Dragon Ball kind of is the myth for everything else, isn't it? No, Naruto, big time with all the tailed beasts and all that stuff.
Heavily
Inuyasha, absolutely, with the demons and half
all
demons.
Japanese mythology. Yes.
God, I said it, but I love Inuyasha, guys. Inuyasha needs more love. What else? What else you threw in? Jujutsu Kaisen, I haven't watched, but it definitely looks like it draws a bit like Demon Slayer. It draws a lot.
It's all about demons and the Japanese treatise
so
on
trendy
demons.
Right now.
It's religion. It's magic religion.
Okay, but Dragon Ball does have scouters and a lizard man from space.
But is that what the show is about?
Is it really?
It's more dressing, but rather than what the treatise and the core root of what the magic system is. The only one I pulled out was Full Metal Alchemist. I think that's more on the sci-fi side of things. I think it's more interested in its philosophy and technology rather than its mythos and religion. But again, it's religion's still there. There's still that very famous scene where Greed gets like hung up on a crucifix. Japan has such a wonderful treatment of mythology.
First of all, we need a Venn diagram for this podcast. Yes. And second of all, I think that the boundaries you've set are excellent, but of course some works are gonna, kind of be a bit of both, leaning towards something, but definitely draw from both.
Yes, yeah. I think at the end of the day, it's asking yourself, what's my core motivator when I'm writing? Am I more concerned with myth, religion? Am I more concerned with I've already forgotten philosophy and technology? And once you know your personal priority, then you lean into those tropes to bring out your story rather than trying to do everything. I think the strongest stories are the ones that know its function and know what tools it's using to achieve that function. Final question before I move on, Matan. With this new definition, what is Star Wars?
I'm so happy you brought up Star Wars. I was going to bring it up, and I was like, wait, hold on. Let her cook. She will get there. Man, Star Wars is basically a guy who read a book about the hero's journey and became a billionaire. Look, back to my 30-second rant 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago. Yeah, Star Wars is clear-cut fantasy. It is not concerned with technology at all. It is not concerned with the limitations of technology. I'm following up on your boundaries. It is not concerned with what technology has turned us. In fact, if people are like breathing on other planets with absolutely no regards to air composition,
it doesn't care.
He couldn't care less about technology. All right, they could be pirates in One Piece, just going from one island to the other. For all he cares.
It does care about religion and mythology. It cares about religion prophecies. So much. It's
and space Jesus.
It's about space Jesus. It is the most religious story you're going to get. It's a fan. Therefore, it is a fantasy. So great. I love that we could circle back to that, and I love it so much. I did just want to put a side note here. We are going to do a big episode on this eventually. I'm sorry if this turns into a longer episode, Matan. I hope you've got time.
All good.
So for me, when I was talking about the idea of like dragons, you've just used dragons as window dressing, or maybe you want to use like Celtic ruins as window dressing, but you're not necessarily engaging with this use. That's where it starts to lean into more appropriation territory for me, because you are just using it in your story as decorate. Maybe you've thought it's cool, and I'm guilty of this, so that's why I'm really happy to talk to it. You just grab something because you think it's cool, and you're like, that's a great aesthetic, and I'm building a world, and I want cool aesthetics. But it's almost the next step is then asking yourself, well, why was I drawn to that? And what is the actual mythology and meaning I'm interested in unpacking
I
for
think
that? Like maybe, yeah, go Matan.
I really agree with you, but I do want to distinguish. It is okay if you are not a northern Scandinavian person. It is okay for you to write about Scandinavian legends in your writing. What is not okay is basically what Ali just said, which is you just take the surface of something because it looks cool, and you don't look. There are no rules. There's no writing police out there, okay? But I think your story and our stories benefit if we do the homework, if we understand what does this thing represent. You know, the Chinese dragon and the Western dragon do not represent the same thing. And just because you want to use and again, these are mythical, non-existent creatures. It's not like you're breaking any law, right? Both of them are made up. But just if you're going to put pyramids in your story, make sure you know what the pyramids were for, and try to. You can break the rules, but you at least have to know what does a dragon stand for, the dragon that you think of, and then you can say, okay, my dragon is different, but it has to come from a place of knowledge. Patrick Rothfuss. Do we have a counter for Patrick Rothfuss?
We should for this episode.
Patrick Rothfuss, I think that he did something really interesting with his dragon. He basically he wrote a dragon in the end of the first novel. Spoiler alert. He decided my dragon is going to be just recognizable enough, but different enough that I feel like I've done service to what it is. And he created this dragon that, for all intents and purposes, feels like a cow. It's a dragon cow. It just rolls.
I just remember it being a really big lumbering lizard.
It's just a
Is
big
my memory of it.
lumbering lizard. It is useless in so many ways, and it's cool. And you feel like it's not that this guy doesn't know what a dragon traditionally looks like, but I think that the meaning that we can take from that, and maybe I'm giving him extra credit, but is that this is an animal. This is a natural. It's a part of nature. And we have this, sometimes we deify parts of nature, and but no, this is part of the living world. It's not this deity, and we are basically hurting the living world that's just trying to live its life in the forest.
And I like that. I think where Patrick may also be coming from is this idea of the mythos, and then now this long his canon of literature, where if you're writing fantasy, you may as well have a scene where your hero's got to fight a dragon. And then this is him adding to that canon, like adding to that. He's like, this is my version of my hero fighting a dragon.
He's just poisoning a dragon, okay? Sorry for the spoiler, but that's what he does.
It's just going that extra step. And I guess that's what I'm asking readers to do. Like, rather than just pick window dressing, pick aesthetics, be like, look, ruins and dragons there's a long canon of their usage, both in fiction and then in culture. What they can represent something more. And if you can use these tools to be in conversation with myth, with religion, then you're exploring this genre that we love, high fantasy, to its fullest, rather than just giving it bells and whistles and make it that can read in an empty way. I just have a little extra example here, circling back to the idea of small stakes makes low fantasy in my mind, and then high stakes is high fantasy. I also thought of the Ghibli movies, in that they're big magical worlds, but the stakes often feel small.
Personal? Yeah.
Yeah, very personal. I'm thinking of Kiki's Delivery Service. This is a story obviously about magic, but it's not about saving the world or fighting gods. It's about growing up. She's got to learn she's going to go get a job. She's going to move out of home for the first time, and she's going to go through a metaphorical magical puberty and not be able to talk to her cat anymore. And it's devastatingly sad.
That
But so
doesn't
for me,
feel
that's
low stakes, Ali. That doesn't feel low stakes at all.
the stakes are intense for her, and it's incredibly engaging, but the stakes aren't, she doesn't have to save this. Well, she does save a part of the city, but she's not saving a whole continent. She's not fighting the rulers of this world. And yeah, she's not dealing with great demons from beyond. So for me, that's a low stakes fantasy setting.
Jumping off of that, don't you feel like that could be one of the flaws of fantasy? We just, especially high fantasy, we just expect the reader to care because the world is going to end. But
And I think it's because people have forgotten why. I think you can have your world-ending stakes and your gods of power, if as long as you remember that this genre exists to be in conversation with things. Like you as an author, what's my take on mythology? How am I adding to this mythology, rather than just using it because it's the expected trope? And same with gods. Have you got something to say about how people interact with gods, how people worship gods, how religion affects our culture? If you've got something to say there, I think that's incredibly exciting. Use all the gods you want. Use all the high stakes of
exactly,
the gods
but
are battling.
yeah, but don't just like. But yeah, that's the thing. Think about it. If you're writing, let's say something nice about Game of Thrones. You know, episode 2 of season 8, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, where they're all just. Is it episode 2? I think it is episode 2. Might be 3. Probably 2. They're just sitting at the fireplace, getting drunk, expecting all of them to die. And to me, just it's just about 10, 11 characters. It is about the end of the world, but you don't care about the end of the fictional world. What you care about is these 7, 8, 10, 12 characters that you've gotten to know who could die. And because it's Game of Thrones, we expected them to die. We expected a lot more of them to die. But that can be the problem. And when you think about Tolkien, when you go back to your memory, you think, okay, it was about, Sauron subjugating or destroying Middle Earth, but that's not really what made us care. What made us care is Sam and Frodo. It's Merry and Pippin. Like the way they made the war so effective is like you got Pippin inside Minas Tirith as it's being invaded. And that is the emotional stakes. You're worried for 1,000 nameless Gondorians, but you're worried more about Pippin than you are about them. And that's, I think when you look at fantasy from the outside, you might think like, oh, okay, that's the conflict. I'm just going to have my dark god threaten destruction over entire continents. But that's not what drew people in, I think.
How has Pippin become the center of this great conflict? How is he going to survive?
Yeah.
Maybe Pippin's not the center. He's briefly the center.
Yeah, okay,
really
fine. You get my point, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's a great point. You made a really interesting comment in episode 70 that I wanted to circle back to. You were praising Patrick Rothfuss for and The Name of the Wind for being this fantastic high and low fantasy hybrid. And I agree. I love that you said that. And viewing it through the lens of scale and stakes, I would say what makes it feel like a hybrid modern fantasy of high and low fantasy is because I guess the stakes, we know in book 3, if we get it one day, will eventually be, it's a war for the continent. We know the war is going to be over the ruler of the continent, and we know the war is going to have like the demons from beyond a little bit. So it's high fantasy in that those are our big stakes, but our everyday stakes for Quoth are the real driver of this book and what makes this book
He's
shine.
got 2 shirts, Ali. The guy's got 2 shirts, for crying out loud.
And that's really dramatic. It is.
How embarrassing would it be to go to... Guys, imagine going to college with 2 shirts. Like, geez, that's bad. I mean, orcs are bad, but 2 shirts.
2 shirts is also really bad. And he's down to like 6 coins that day, and that is so stressful.
I was so stressed about his financial situation, I swear to God. More than mine, like...
Exactly. You just want him to get the next gig so he can make some money. So that's what I mean by low stakes, but they feel really intense. But technically, those are low stakes. We're not talking about kings or gods, but that series, when it's done, will be an excellent example of balancing the two really well and making it feel like quite a modern fantasy. This is the direction fantasy is going.
Can I very, very, very shortly just drag us to the development 18th century for a second, just for a second, I promise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, the movement that has been happening since basically the conception of the Western novel, somewhere with Robinson Crusoe, is that stories used to be, if you look at the Greek tragedies, used to be about the upper echelons of society, the people who are not concerned with money, they're concerned with prophecies and sphinx riddles and basically the Aragorn problems of the world, you know, defeating Sauron. But as we got deeper into the time of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, the idea was that you could tell the story of the middle person. It's not only about the kings and queens of great nations, but also about the problems of the baker or the problems later on of the orphan just walking around the city. And I think that when you look at high fantasy and low fantasy and stakes, that kind of mirrors that movement away from world-ending catastrophes to something as simple as a single human being abused by her brother, as we see at the beginning of the Mistborn, right? When she's basically the protagonist is being used for her luck by a bunch of gangsters, right? If I remember correctly.
Yes.
Before you
Yes.
even get to all the high stuff.
No, I love that you've brought that up. I think it's an excellent segue into my very final topic, which is Brandon Sanderson, who I was leaving at the end here.
Yeah.
And he's very quickly, if not already, established himself as the master of modern fantasy. I know a lot of people very recently I've been pushing and shoving to get to read him. And look, I can post my recommended reading list for the Cosmere because I have strong feelings about the order in which you should read the Cosmere. But no spoilers here that Brandon Sanderson's work is very much rooted in myth and religion. And it is interesting because he's also highly like a high profile member of the Mormon Church. And that's actually quite common in America. There's this very interesting movement, not movement's not the right word, but a commonality where there's a lot of fantasy writers in Salt Lake City, which there's a lot of Mormons there. So, and that fascinates me from afar. I'm like, why are there so many sci-fi and fantasy writers coming out of Salt Lake City? And I think it is this idea that he clearly has a lot to say about myth and religion. And there's always a little bit of a reckoning I have with, oh, I love this author, but I don't have the same religious beliefs as them. And then you wonder, am I being secretly fed like Mormon propaganda? Like that's maybe my fear. But in lesser hands, maybe I would be being fed Mormon propaganda. But that's not the sense I get at all from Branderson's stuff. I think he's someone who is deeply embedded in the church, and because of that, perhaps he's perfectly positioned to have a modern take on religion and mythology and bring that to the masses through fantasy. So my little aside is I don't consider myself religious, but I am aware that the society I'm raised in, like culturally, is shaped by religion. But I do believe perhaps maybe more in myth, in that at the deep center of my core, a lot of the things I believe about, I was going to say truth and justice, but that sounds very Superman. But I think they are shaped at an unconscious level by myths and storytelling. So this is me getting on my soapbox a little bit, but I am talking to those out there who want to write high fantasy, and therefore, whether you knew it or not before today, want to engage with myth and religion. You can improve, and I can improve my high fantasy writing by spending more time with my sense of what do I want to say about myth structures and their influence on culture and society. Because I fundamentally believe that I became a writer because I believe the stories we tell shape us as individuals and peoples. The myths we have been told throughout time have shaped us as individuals and peoples. And writing is one of the strongest tools we have, and therefore fantasy is one of the best tools we have to talk about this. We are storytellers, we are culture shapers, we are myth makers, and therefore that is why high fantasy is super relevant. So next time you ever feel like you might be having some like genre cringe about, oh, I write fantasy. No, you're writing myth. Like that's what you care about, even if you've never articulated it to yourself. There you go, I've articulated it for you. Please use that in the next argument you get into with someone about fantasy. So, just to throw you a curveball, Matan, I'm pretty far removed from religion to the sense that I would posit the Bible is one of the earliest and best works of high fantasy, and therefore the genre of the Bible is high fantasy. And again, when Paddy said that he observed that so much of high fantasy is influenced by Judeo-Christendom, I think it's almost the other way around, in that all works of fantasy that have had to come since have to live in the canon of this great shadow that the first great work of fantasy was the Bible.
I agree, but I do want to argue the Bible is the first well-recorded, well-preserved work of fantasy.
Well-preserved. Okay, yes.
Because
that's probably the better way of saying it.
I think there has been a crazy wealth of Genesis myths over the years. You look at the Enuma Elish, for example, which has existed even before the Jewish Bible, which is another creation myth that existed before. And I'm sure there have been thousands of oral myths, over Australia, Africa, America, that have been just as detailed and incredible as what the Bible tells. But where the Bible stands out is how it's been preserved so I don't want to say perfectly, but so well that the Bible that we are reading is the same Bible that was read 1,500 years ago, or probably very, very, very similar to the one that was read 2,000 years ago. So yes, I do believe the fantasy does take a lot from that, and I think that's why Paddy said it, that fantasy comes from the Judeo-Christian ideas. But then again, if going back to what we said before and what you said, if you just take the offshoots, if you just take the shallow part, which is the methods used in the stories, then you don't understand where it comes from, because the Bible clearly comes from a do and don't list of things that you're supposed to derive from the stories. I'm not religious at all either, but I have read the Hebrew Bible in its entirety, because that's a thing you have to do here at school. And I do think it's definitely a huge influence on fantasy. But if you look at Tolkien, a lot of it actually came from Beowulf, which is, if you really want to go back, that's a 9th century. Some argue the first book ever written, maybe not ever written, but the earliest book that they can actually find. They cannot find something, at least in Old English, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
It's up there. And if you take from the past, from the myths, out of a place of taking the time to understand them, I think you can come up with much better fantasy than if you just, look at it from a distance and say, oh, they used a talking lion, I'm going to use a talking lion, without knowing the talking lion is actually Jesus. But okay.
But you're right. The symbols have weight, and you can engage with them, find your own meaning. And that's the beauty of writing. I'm going to make up a whole secondary world. I'm going to have words and languages and names and things that never existed. But what you're engaging within this is how a religion affects a people. This is how a myth affects a people. You can be inventing your religion, but if you're using symbols and artifacts and tropes that have come from other origins, just being well read and aware of them so you can have your next take on it, I think is all we're advocating for. That's where the exciting and the new can come from, and how you can feel like you're doing something new in this space. And I think myth doesn't always have to be the ancient. I was waiting for you to bring up My Hero Academia, and if you came up with that, because I'm like, where does that fall?
I was
and
burned by the ending, Ali. The ending just.
I've given up on it, unfortunately. Yeah. But I'm like, what myth is it based on? I'm like, it's based on the Superman myth, obviously. Like it took me a few seconds. I'm like, what is it based on? I'm like, it's based on Superman, and the cultural myth that Superman's now been around long enough that that is a myth.
That is myth.
That's why we live in the Marvel universe now, because we're having a knee-jerk reaction to comic myth in popular culture.
That's a cool modern myth. Yeah, I mean, it is. You could say it comes from the Hercules myth, but it's different enough that you can argue that they're both super powerful, but other than that, there are not too many similarities.
Yes, I think you can trace the origin and the bloodline from like My Hero to Superman to Hercules, but I think My Hero, its stepping stone is Superman's there, we're
Yes,
now this. Yeah.
absolutely. Maybe,
We're gonna end.
yeah.
Ooh.
No, I was just gonna throw creepy pastas in there as modern, unsettling
Ooh.
myths in the making. But yeah.
I love that. I was just going to end this with a final shout out to Brandon Sanderson because I think he's spent a lot of time, like over 30 books, a lot of time
Yeah.
on myth and religion. And I think we're starting to see the transition to his sci-fi. I think this is my prediction, I might be wrong, but I think he's said a lot of, that he wants to say about myth and religion. He now wants to talk philosophy and technology. We've seen it in Mistborn quite deliberately. He takes this from a medieval setting to a Western setting, and then he's already told us the next setting is set in space. So we know technology, it's less about gods now. Gods will still be there, but they're no longer the focus. And so I find that fascinating. And I think it's going to transition to philosophy discussion just with god characters. And there's some funny, very quotes in Mistborn in because spoilers, Sazed is now God in Era 2, and Waxillian will talk to him and be like, you guys should have the radio by now. So this is God literally yelling at the protagonist about technology, and I just love that as a perfect example. The Sunlit Man, have you read or listened to The Sunlit Man yet, Matan?
I haven't. Is it good?
It's one of his newest ones. It is good. It features a character from Roshar as the protagonist, so if that interests you. It's definitely going to be, it's set after the final Stormlight 5 that's coming out this December.
Wait, so
get hype, everyone.
It's set after a book that hasn't... Okay, sure.
Correct. Because the Cosmere timeline's
he has to have Hermione's time turner. There's no other explanation, right?
I'm fascinated by this.
He has one. He has one.
I know that exists.
Either that or Shadow Clone Jutsu. One of the two. There's no other.
Because I think Sixth of the Dusk, which is a short story of his, well, being a novella, he can't write short stories. Who are we kidding? A novella of his, it was also set with the same technology that Sunlit Man have, that is Era 3, Mistborn, that doesn't exist yet. And then I just wanted to land on the character of Yasna as our very final conversation piece.
Good. Yeah.
Because Yasna, I think, is the center point of the Cosmere for the very reason that she is the tension of all four of those things. She is the perfect meeting place of myth, religion, technology, and philosophy. Would you like to unpack that, Matan, now that I've thrown that out there?
You know, a lot of the things we said today about how to do good fantasy and all these things and how to do bad fantasy, I have this little voice in my head that says, you know what, I don't think they're doing it on purpose. I think it's almost like the way we learn how to talk as babies is that we just absorb language and we do it. And I think writers, even ones like Sanderson, who plot a lot and they're architects and all that, I think a lot of the stuff that they do well, like what you just mentioned about one of the characters being the crucible of so many things, I think that's just... I wonder if that's on purpose or if that's just the natural outcome of writing talent that has been cultivated and honed and it just comes out that way. Like, do you think that he meant for that to happen? Do you think that it just slowly galvanized in a way and then he became aware of it and kind of started pushing that way a bit more?
I think I would probably credit it, towards maybe a lot of this we do organically. Certainly with a lot of my first drafts, I know I just got to get it all on the page. And then I ask myself, what's this all about? What are all these symbols and things I'm playing with? And then I usually find the meaning later. And I guess the more time I spend as a writer and getting older, I am trying to put more effort into understanding and doing the analyzing and not just, trust the process for a first draft. But if I actually want to elevate my work to the next level, I think intention has to come into it at some point. And I wonder if Brandonson with Yasna is just like, I'm going to have her be a bit conflicting between these two things. But what he's perfectly done is she's a character who's blessed by the religion of the world. So she's literally one of the magical people and therefore kind of a part of the big myth arc. But by day, her job is she literally studies myths, religions, histories, and is a philosopher on those things.
Yeah,
And then also she's deeply invested in the
I
technology
agree.
progress of the world.
I agree. I just feel like the first time we see her, she felt more like the classic mentor character, just there to progress Shallan. Like
And then she's
that's why I'm
grown
saying,
into
did
this.
he intend for that or not? Because she was very much, like you felt okay, Shallan and Kaladin are going to be the heart of whatever is going to come, and these characters are just around to push them, and maybe further along the way, he found himself more interested, okay, in Yasna, and like, ooh, why is
I
she the
think
way
so.
she is?
Yeah, I think I don't know. I would never put it past Branderson not to have thought it out all the way, but especially because in the latest book he's paired her with Wit, and Wit is very clearly the center of the Cosmere. And now that
He's
they're a semi-romantic thing, like I think Yasna's going to be around for the long game. Anyway, that's my pitch. We'll all get to find out in not long actually, because Branderson writes pretty quickly. Maybe in 5 years we'll get to find out if I'm way off track and giving
I
him
have
way too
a
much credit, or
I have a movie for you to write. What do you call it? A prompt. Uh,
yeah.
Brandon Sanderson wakes up in the body of George R.R. Martin, and George R.R. Martin wakes up in the body of Brandon Sanderson,
Oh no,
and
like
they're
a
both
Freaky
told
Friday.
that until they publish their novels, they don't get to go back. Does
They've got to fulfill all their writing contracts.
does Martin die as Sanderson? That's the question.
Oh, what a tragic end. Because Branderson will like finish it and then he'll be waiting to swap back. And he's like, why haven't I swapped back yet? And then he's going to have to fly across the world and find himself. Because it's just going to be George being like, I don't know.
And George is younger, so he's got
perfect.
nowhere to go. We just added 50 years to his lifespan. Poor guy.
George has to go to church. Yeah, no, that's the perfect comedy. Amazing. All right, that is our episode. That is our deeper dive into high fantasy. We did it. We went as we're all grubby, covered in dirt from all that digging we've just done. I didn't ask you to find a quote, Matan, but do you have a quote to finish us off with?
Well, a wise man. What? No, I have nothing. Okay, so here's one from N.K. Jemisin. All right, the writer of the
great.
5th season.
It's brilliant.
She says, "Let's start with the end of the world. Why don't we? Get it over with and move on to more interesting things."
Ooh, love that. Mythology heavy, end of the world, religion heavy. Oh,
That's kind of where
good
fantasy
stuff.
is now, right? Like, let's get over with the world is ending. Fine, let's do the interesting stuff.
That's good stuff. All right.
Cool.
Thank you for listening, everyone. Leave us a review. Buy our book. I was going to say books, but there's only one at the minute. Another one's coming. So get ready to buy that. And we'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Ali.
You're listening to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.